But today I wanted to talk. But today I wanted to talk about the sugya, the controversy surrounding kitniyot, and rather than talk so much about the specifics and bottom line halacha, and each family and community have their own important minhagim, sort of to discuss a little bit the discussions as the minhag developed, and sort of try and track and trace it throughout Jewish history. We know that when it comes to kitniot, there are various minhagim. On a broader scale, we speak about Ashkenazim versus Sfaradim, but even that is a generalization, because whereas Ashkenazim traditionally had the minhag, we know there are those who in the Sfaradi community, certainly in Morocco and other communities from North Africa and Spain, who do refrain from certain kitniot, whether it's rice or some of the original grains, whereas those from the Adot HaMizrach communities from the east didn't adopt the minhag generally at all. And we know, of course, within Ashkenazi communities, there are different minhagim, depending whether you're Yekish stock or you're Litvish stock or Hasidish, or whether you grew up like myself in the UK or you grew up in the US. And especially when you make Aliyah, it's going to be a little bit disorienting when you come from your minhagim and things that you always thought were kitniot, and you come here and people do not accept as kitniot. Questions around foods like quinoa and canola and peanuts, and obviously various minhagim for different communities as well. So we might touch on a couple of some of the specific issues, but we're going to talk more broadly about the discussions around the gezerah, the decree, or the minhag, not to eat kitniot, and try and trace it and the back and forth around it through the generations. So, of course, this is a minhag, as we know, which originated in Ashkenaz. And as a result, it's not surprising that it doesn't appear in the Mishnah or the Gemara. Having said that, the Mishnah and Gemara do discuss rice in the context of Pesach, obviously not in terms of the decree of kitniot, but rather the halachic status of rice. And this is a machloket in the Tanaim of the Mishnah, a dispute in the Mishnah. So if we look at source 1 here in Masechet Pesachim, in the second chapter of Masechet Pesachim, in source 1, the Mishnah tells as follows, in the context of what one can bake matzahs with. What can one make matzah out of? The Mishnah says in source 1, Elu dvarim she'adam yotzeh behem yidei chavotah b'Pesach. The following items a person can fulfill their obligation with. You can make matzah out of the following. And there's a list of 5 grains: bechitim, wheat, seorim, barley, kusmin, spelt, chiffon, rye, or shibolet shual. Shibolet shual, which is commonly believed to be oats. That's how we use the term today. There's a debate about whether the oats today are exactly the oats of the times of the Talmud, but nonetheless, these are the 5 categories. What are known as the chameshet minei dagan, the 5 grains. Now we know these 5 grains not just in terms of hilchot matzah and chametz, but also in terms of hilchot brachot, because these are the 5 grains that when you cook them or bake them, they become mezonot and they require an al hamichya. However, the Gemara points out that whilst these are the 5 grains which one can bake matzahs with, there is an additional opinion of the Tanaim of the Mishnah, which was obviously in dispute with this Mishnah, and therefore the Gemara continues there in source 1. Gemara says the Gemara on this Mishnah, Matnitin delok Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, that this Mishnah, which counts 5 grains, which can be the source of the wheat or the grain rather for your matzah, is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, the Amar, because Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri doesn't just count 5, but he counts further. The Amar, because Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri holds, unlike the Chachamim of the Mishnah, that orez, which we assume to be rice, as the word means today in modern Hebrew, min daganhu. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri actually held that rice was considered one of the grains, and therefore v'chayavin al chimutzo karet. And somebody, according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, who would eat rice on Pesach is chayav karet, just like somebody who were to eat wheat, which is chametz, which is leavened on Pesach. The Tanya, as we learn in the Breita, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri oser be'orez v'dochan. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri would prohibit eating rice or millet on Pesach, mipnei shekarov lahachmitz, because it sort of, a bad translation here, karov lahachmitz, it's close to leavening, it sort of leavens. There is some chemical reaction when rice or millet is soaked in water for an extended period, albeit not the same way that the 5 grains. We talk about wheat, barley, spelt, rye, and oats. We know that spelt is seen as some sort of derivative from or closely related to wheat, whereas rye and oats are more closely related to barley. When it comes to orez v'dochan, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri counts rice and millet. Millet's a different type of Orez is usually like white rice, and dochan is other types of sort of rice type grains. But nonetheless, it's fascinating that he adds to the list. Now, this is a double-edged sword. It works both ways, both in terms of matzah and in terms of chametz. The Gemara is understanding that if you consider rice and millet to be, like Rabbi Yochanan does, to be chametz, then in the same way, you're also able to use it to make matzah. So there's a double machloket here between the Chachamim of the Mishnah and Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Because on the one hand, the Chachamim say it's only these five grains which are chametz, and rice is not considered chametz. On the other hand, you can only use these five grains, but rice matzah, you can't fulfill your obligation of matzah on Seder night with rice matzah, if there was such a thing. In contrast, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri counts orez and dochan as well as chametz, meaning if it were to be in contact with water and would leaven, it would be chametz. But on the other hand, he says, since it's chametz, if you cook it within 18 minutes, then you could actually have rice matzah fulfill your Torah obligation on of eating matzah on Seder night. So if you hold that rice is in the Mishnah is considered chametz, if it's left to leaven, you can also use it for matzah. In contrast, the Chachamim reject the position of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri and hold that you cannot use it for matzah, but that also means that it cannot become chametz. So the discussions around rice, of course, are not in terms of the minhag of Kitniyot. There's actually a fundamental discussion already at the times of the Mishnah, recognizing that rice is similar in some properties. It sort of leavens, or at least it swells, but doesn't leaven. And the Gemara there, which I didn't bring on the source sheet, ultimately discusses that it sort of swells, albeit doesn't fully leaven. Nonetheless, there is such a position in the Tanaim. However, we know that the halacha follows the chachamim, and therefore rice is not considered chametz on Pesach, as the Rambam rules here in source 2. Ein adam yotzeh chovat achilat matzah, ele im kein achla me'achad chameshet haminin. You can only fulfill your obligation of matzah on Seder night if your matzah is made of one of the five grains. Shene'amar, as it says, Sefer Devarim, lo tochal alav chametz shivat yamim, lo tochal alav chametz, shivat yamim tochal alav matzot. You cannot eat chametz, and for 7 days you should eat matzah. So what do we learn? We learn that the two are interconnected, says the Rambam, exactly as I've just explained. Varim haba'im lidei chimutz, something which can be leavened, im achalan matzah, yatsa b'hen yidei chovato. If you eat it when it doesn't leaven, meaning you bake it into matzah, you can fulfill your obligation. Aval shar dvarim, but other things could go on orez v'dochan, like rice and mallet. Kitniyot, interesting, the Rambam says, kitniyot, he adds there, other sort of legumes. Ein yotzeh b'hen yidei matzah, lifnei she'en pen chametz. You cannot fulfill your obligation if you bake them into matzah, because they don't leaven. Only things which have the potential to become chametz can you actually bake and fulfill your obligation of matzah with. And rice is excluded. Now, we know explicitly from the Gemara that rice is excluded because the halacha follows the Chachamim against Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. What's interesting is to see Rashi's commentary on that discussion, because Rashi, the Gadol, the head of Ashkenaz, one of the most famous Ashkenazi Rishonim, living in the second half of the 11th century, also relates to the sugya and neglects to mention any minhag or halacha regarding not eating it because of an Ashkenazic practice of kitniyot, which is telling about perhaps what Rashi himself may have done. So let's see the discussion there in source 3. Now we're jumping to the last parak of Psachim, which deals with the laws of the Seder night in source 3. And the Mishnah tells us about the Seder plate and the things which are on the Seder table for the Seder. And in the string of Mishnayot dealing with the Seder of the Seder, the order of the Seder, the Mishnah says as follows in source 3. Heviu lefanav matzah v'chazeret. So we know that you bring before the people who are eating Seder, matzah and chazeret, v'charoset. So again, the chazeret is functioning here as maror perhaps, and the charoset, ushnei tafshilin, and 2 cooked foods. Now we to this day do this on our Seder plate. We have the 2 tafshilim. The minhag, the prevalent minhag is to use a beitza and a zaroa, which is in commemorating the Korban Chagiga and the Korban Pesach respectively. But the Mishnah itself doesn't say you have to have a zaroa and a beitza. It talks about shnei tafshilin. It talks about 2 cooked foods. And guess what these two cooked foods were in the house of Rav Huna? So the Gemara tells us there in the continuation of source 3, the second line, my shnei tafshilin, what are the 2 cooked foods? So Amar Rav Huna, what would he bring to his Seder? And he said you should bring, what should the 2 cooked foods be on the Seder plate? Silka va'aruza. So you've got here selek, so you've got like cooked beets, va'aruza, and orez. So lo and behold, Rav Huna on his Seder plate had rice. He didn't have a beitza and a and a Zarah, he had a Selek and Orez, which is fascinating. And not only that, but the Gemara goes on to tell us, Rava have a Mahada Asilka Aruza. Rava would always be particular to look for Selek and Orez, to look for his cooked foods on his Seder plate, not the baits and the Zarah, but he would have Selek and Orez. He would have beets and rice for the two cooked dishes. Ho'il v'nafik mipomei de Rav Huna. Once he saw that Rav Huna had ruled that way, he decided this is what he should do. Says the Gemara, Amar of Ashi, you see from there, Shema minad Rav Huna, we learn from the comments of Rav Huna that he would dafka look for Orez, that late the Chaysh lahad Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, that in terms of practical halacha, nobody is concerned with the position of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Like we saw in source 1, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri held that rice actually is chametz if it's left to leaven. We see from the fact that Rav Huna would go looking for rice, and it wasn't special Pesach rice. It was basically the equivalent of putting flour on your Seder plate. And clearly, we're not concerned lahalacha for the position of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. And in fact, it's almost comical to imagine that Rav Huna actually had rice, especially if you're really Ashkenazi born and bred like me, to imagine that Rav Huna would have had rice on his Seder plate. And nonetheless, that's what the Gemara tells us. What's fascinating is Rashi, the Gadol of Ashkenaz, the leader of Ashkenaz's comment there in source 4. Rashi says on that Gemara, Shmami, now we see from here, Mitaka'ama Rav Huna bevashlin Orez bepesach v'lo chayesh lechimutz late techashlat Rabbi Yochanan. We see from here from the fact that they would cook rice on Pesach, and no one was concerned that it might come to leaven, that no one's concerned the position of Rabbi Yochanan. And that's all that Rashi says there. Now we know we have Rashi, we have Rashbam, and the Rashi on Arvei Pesachim is not clear exactly, if it's authentic Rashi or an earlier draft of Rashi, but it's just fascinating that the discussion there, what you'd expect Rashi to say, but we don't do this, right, in Ashkenaz. Rashi doesn't say that. He just brings the Gemara as is and comments on the fact that in the Gemara's times they would put rice on the Seder plate means clearly the halacha is not like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. He doesn't add, though, that we in Ashkenaz don't do this, which seems to imply that at least if taking this Rashi, at least on face value, if we're able to do that Rashi himself didn't engage in any discussions of the minhagim of Kitniyot. However, you jump about 100 to 150 years later, and already we have discussions and almost a universal practice in Ashkenaz to avoid Kitniyot on Pesach. Now, already in the 12th century, there are a couple of musings and mentions in niche places. There's a sefer called the Sefer Minhagot, Rav Asher Milunil, not the famous Rosh Milunil, but a different Rabbeinu Asher ben Shaul Milunil, and he himself has musings in his Sefer Minhagot, not Minhagim, it's called the Sefer Minhagot, and he has there already a mention in the 12th century Ashkenaz that people are refraining from utilizing or eating Kitniyot on Pesach. Nonetheless, when you get to the next generation, sort of towards the end of the Baalei Tosfot, in the 13th century, the most famous mention is in the Sefer called the Smak. Smak, the Sefer Mitzvot Katan, which is written by the Remik or Vil. However, it's not in the Sefer Mitzvot Katan itself that it's mentioned, but it's actually in the glosses of Rabbeinu Peretz. Rabbeinu Peretz was known to be one of the later Baalei Tosfot, and he's writing here glosses on the Sefer of his Rebbe. His teacher was the Remik or Vil, who wrote the Smak, the Sefer Mitzvot Katan, an important book of enumerating all the mitzvot. And he wrote, Rabbeinu Peretz, was known as one of the Baalei Tosfot, one of the important authorities of Ashkenaz, certainly in France. He wrote his glosses on his Rebbe's Sefer, and he, in the 13th century, already brings a more comprehensive discussion around the minhag of Kitniyot. So we're going to have a look at this in source 5, and I hope you're brushing up on your French here, or at least your ancient French, because it's going to help us here. And he says as follows in source 5. So we're already moving away from Rashi now. We're going already 100 to 150 years later, and says the Rabbeinu Peretz in his glosses on the Sefer Mitzvot Katan here in source 5. Vala Kitniyot, when it comes to Kitniyot, legumes, pogon, pois. Anyone speak French? Pois is peas. Very grateful I listened in high school French. So pois is peas. Or poulet is not chicken like it means in French. It means the poulim, the beans. Baris, which is obviously rice. Va'adashim, and lentils, v'kayot sebahem, and similar food items. Rabotenu nohagim bahem isur. So already he speaks about that. Our rabbis already practice that these particular early kitniyot, the rice, the beans, the peas and lentils. These are the categories that he mentions here explicitly, and the like, though. It's not an exhaustive list. He says, and sebehem. Our rabbis have already practiced, meaning the Baalei Tosfot, to prohibit them, shalola ochlam b'Pesach klal, not to eat them on Pesach at all. I also recall hearing from other Rabbanim, you're not even supposed to cook them, beans on Pesach, unless it's in boiling water in order to stop them leavening. Having said that, when it comes to certain beans, there are gedolim in his time who treat them as permissible to eat. And he quotes a dissenting view of other Rishonim in France at the time, and he quotes the famous Rabbeinu Yechiel mi Paris, one of the prominent Baalei Tosfot, who was also his Rebbe, a different Rebbe of his. He was the Rebbe of his Rebbe was the Rebbe de Corville, but also he learned by Rabbi Yechiel mi Paris, one of the great authorities from the Baalei Tosfot in France. And he says Rabbeinu Yechiel would in fact eat peas on Pesach. He says Umori Rabbeinu Yechiel haya noheg le'echol b'Pesach hul halavan. He would eat the white bean shekorin pois. He would eat peas. V'gam haya omer ken b'shem gedolim. He would also cite many authorities who allowed such a thing. So although he starts by talking about Rabotenu nohagim behem isur, that certainly when it comes to certain foods, that already there's a consensus, or a broad consensus among the Rishonim of Ashkenaz in France, at the very least, to not partake in Kitniyot. He mentions that his Rebbe, Rabbeinu Yechiel in Paris, would still eat at least these particular beans, and the list, it was no longer, was not yet solidified as a particular list, and the minhag was still sort of being built up. Having cited the fact there are those that partake in some things, and nonetheless there was still a broad consensus not to partake in Kitniyot, he goes on to provide the rationale and ultimately say that this is the minhag. And he says, Mihu kasher davar me'od lahatir davar shenogim bo ha'olam isur mimei chachamim hakadmonim. He says it's difficult to permit a practice or a custom which has already been practiced already from the early Chachamim. Now, the question of the Mei Chachamim HaKadmonim, there's a lot of question marks around this phrase, because how early is he speaking? Because we didn't see it mentioned in Rashi. We don't see it really on record until him, or at least the previous generation. So it's difficult to understand what he means when he talks about the Chachamim HaKadmonim, because this minhag is 100 or so years old, 150 at most, and certainly didn't have the universal consensus that he's describing until that point. And even then, it wasn't, as we know, it wasn't fully universal. He says, the mistama lo nahagubo isur machmat chimutz atzmo. The reason that the Ashkenazi Rishonim, the Baalei Tosfot in Ashkenaz, took on this tradition was not because they're concerned that the rice or the beans can actually leaven themselves, right? We don't rule like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri that we saw in the previous sources. We're not concerned that rice or legumes can actually leaven. Right? Every elementary school kid knows the Mishnayos, of course, Baal Peh, and knows that, of course, we don't follow the position of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, and that rice is not actually chametz. The Mishnah Pesachim says explicitly there's only the 5 grains which are a problem of chametz, and therefore he explains that the minhag, as we know, came from a different concern. We should establish and uphold the minhag and maintain it. And we should prohibit in Ashkenaz. He's talking in France, but meaning an Ashkenazic jury, he's paskening for here, all kitniot, all legumes on Pesach. And he gives 3 reasons for that. He says, it's not because they themselves leaven. It's a mistake, it's an error to say we're actually concerned that the product is going to leaven. It's not really chametz. It's particularly because of the decree, and he gives 3 reasons. Now they seem to overlap a little bit, but there's a common denominator between them. But we'll see the 3 reasons which I put in bold here. Firstly, the kivan, if there's a question, please feel free to speak up. The kevan the kitnit ma'aseh, since kitniot are cooked into cooked dishes, v'daganami ma'aseh, you can also make cooked dishes out of the 5 grains which are chametz. Kadaisa, like porridge, like oatmeal. On kitnit, if we were to allow rice pudding, right? We might come to accidentally allow oatmeal. And the two can be mixed up when some people might be, I'm a bit of a novice in the kitchen, but some people might not be able to tell better, and you might tell if it's a rice-based sort of breakfast cereal versus whether it is a wheat-based cereal or barley or oats or whatever it might be, and therefore there's a concern that the final product looks the same on the shelf, and there could be a mix-up. And if you allow one, then the masses who are unaware of the halachot would come to permit the other. At the end of the day, the finished product looks the same. So one is the concern of coming to permit a wheat product because if you permit a rice product and the like. He goes on to say in the penultimate line, V'gam midei de midganhu. It's also something which can be made into grain, into flour. Like the 5 grains. Because legumes also are able to be turned into flour. So the second reason he provides is that you can make a sack of rice flour just like you can make a sack of wheat flour. And because you make both into grain, into flour, there is a concern of coming from one to permit inadvertently the other or even mix them up. And the third reason he gives is not because of the finished product, nor because of like a cooked dish, nor because of the grain itself, but actually because it's similar to the first answer, really, in terms of bread. Not in terms of a cooked dish, but you can actually bake it into loaves like bread, like the 5 grains. And therefore people may come to mix them up. It does seem the common denominator, as we know, between each of the things is that this is a minhag which was taken on because of a concern for mix-up. What's interestingly absent here is that the Rabbeinu Peretz here in the Smak does not actually mention the reason of that they grow together in the field and they'll come to get mixed up, which is mentioned by other authorities. The Rabbeinu Manoach and other on the Rambam and other commentaries mention that one, which is actually the Mishnah Berurah in his Bir Halacha actually accepts that, perhaps even to be one of the more compelling reasons, which is still relevant today, which is not these reasons that people might come to mix up. Today, your average Joe, or your average Jew, I should say, knows that you cannot, what chametz is, and that wheat is chametz, but rice is not necessarily chametz, albeit minhag of kitniyot. The Amei Haaretz, the masses at the times of the Rabbeinu Peretz, it seems, weren't too aware of even the basic halachot. Nonetheless, today we have even your average Jew has a broader knowledge, and therefore you might argue that these reasons are less relevant today, which are about mix up and coming to mix things up, but rather the other reason which is absent here, but actually that in the field we know that, and again I'm not a farmer, but my understanding is that in the field itself, sometimes we do a year of corn followed by a year of wheat or a year of rice followed by whatever it might be in order for the health of the field, and as a result, that reason is certainly relevant today about grains and things getting perhaps mixed up. That concern is more legitimate today. Nonetheless, the original decree doesn't list that, but rather lists these things below, that there's a mix-up, that if you come to admit one thing, then it may lead to another. There's a comment here in the Suan Jack Gorlin that I heard in a previous year that Rabbi Chilma Paris would put some kitniyot on his Seder plate to make the point that it was not chametz. Certainly could be. We know that apparently he used to eat peas on Pesach. That's explicit here in the Rabbeinu Peretz. What's fascinating is that Rav Huna already in the Gemara would actually put rice on his Seder plate, not to dispel the minhag of kitniyot, but simply because he had never heard of such a gezerah, because it only came obviously 600 or so years, or even more, 700-800 years later at the earliest. So that is the position, and from here it sort of all starts to, I wouldn't say unravel, but it all starts to emanate from here. That after the original gezerah, the words Rabbeinu Peretz, it was subsequently, it seems that this minhag had really taken root, and despite Rabbeinu Yechil Paris's desires, it was not his position that prevailed. The Mordechai, who's a famous Rishon, one of the Talmidim of the Maharam in Rothenburg, but also a son-in-law of Rabbi Yechiel Paris, also comments about it, and he says in source 6. This is now in the late 13th century. Says the Mordechai in source 6. Rabbeinu Baruch Rabbeinu Shimshon me Avira, which is in France, Lo hayu ochlim minei kitniyot Pesach. They would not eat kitniyot on Pesach. Aval harav yichil mi Paris, which is also his father-in-law, haya ragil le'achol pula lavan shekorim peas. So he would eat peas. So he talks about he probably even saw it on his father-in-law's Seder table that his father-in-law would have Rabbi Yechiel would eat peas, but he already cites that many other Rishonim throughout France would not eat kitniot. This is the story in France. Ashkenaz is obviously the term Ashkenaz typically refers to German Jewry. And we know about the Baalei Tosfot from France and the discussions there, and that the minhag, Rabbi Yechiel was in the minority opinion, and ultimately that minhag disseminated throughout Ashkenazic Jewry. But it's interesting to note that if this was the discussion going on in France, Rabbi Yerucham, who lived in Ashkenaz in Germany, didn't there the minhag they were more skeptical about. Perhaps they liked their rice on Pesach, whatever it might have been, but they weren't so convinced that the circumstances which led to the decree in France should have been extended to the community in Germany. And look what Rabbi Yerucham, one of the great Rishonim of Ashkenaz, not in France but in Germany, says in Source 7. He says he's aware of the minhag. Those who had the custom not to eat rice or cooked legumes on Pesach, kitniot, minhag shtutu. It's a foolish minhag. Zulati imhem osim lahachmir alatzman. Unless they're just doing it to take on additional chumras, right? There are many chumras that people take on with Pesach, but he says, "V'lo yadati lama." I don't know why they're doing it. So Rabbi Yerucham, was not overly thrilled about the minhag, and Rabbi Yerucham, speaking at a similar time, essentially says, "I'm aware of the minhag, but I don't think the reasons given that the matters are going to come mixed up, and if you're going to allow rice pudding on Pesach, that they're going to allow oatmeal on Pesach." He felt that was not compelling, and he calls it a minhag shtut, unless it's just like the world of chumras. We know, though, it's not the world of chumras. He's trying to be malamed zchut. He's trying to justify the minhag, but ultimately he rejects it. What's interesting is we saw the Mordechai who brings that. No, there were those already in France. He brings Rabbi Baruch, Rabbi Shimshon Me'avira, and we know who were machmir on kitniot. But a contemporary of the Mordechai is the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher, as we go over the page here to source 8. And just in terms of just to remind people geographically, in terms of the chronology of matters, one of the great Ashkenazi Rishonim was the Maharam of Rothenburg, the Maharam of Rothenburg, and he had three famous Talmidim of Hakim. He had three distinguished students who were the Mordechai, the Hagahot Maimoniot, who wrote a commentary on the Rambam, and the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher. We know that the Mordechai and the Hagahot Maimoniot were tragically killed al Kiddush Hashem. They were murdered with their families. And the Rosh, who is the third famous Talmud of the Maharam, subsequently escaped from Ashkenaz and he fled to Spain. And the Rosh, his son, is the Tur. So the Rosh is a little bit of a hybrid Ashkenazi Sephardi because he started his life as a Talmud of the Maharam, but subsequently made it across and fled to Spain, and his son is the Tur. And the Rosh writes as follows in source 8. He says, in terms of the sugya which we saw discussing about whether rice is even considered chametz at the times of the Mishnah. Ultimately, as we know in source 8, the Rosh says, "Velet hilchata Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, the oser be'orez v'dochan." As we know, the halacha follows the Chachamim against Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, who had prohibited rice and millet, mipnei sherov karov lahachmitz, because even he forbade it because it sort of swells and sort of leavens, or not entirely. It's not true. We paskin like the Chachamim. The kol davar she'en mechameshet haminin, anything which is not one of the 5 grains, ein ba lidei chemutz. It does not leaven. Umutar la'asot b'menu tafshil pesach. So the Rosh, quite aware about the discussions going on in the Beit Midrash where he himself came from, in both Ashkenaz and Sarfat, both in Ashkenaz and in France, in Germany and France, neglects, I don't think neglects, but deliberately leaves out and says the halacha is like the Chachamim, rice is not chametz, and therefore it's permissible, mutar la'asot b'menu tafshil b'pesach. It's permissible to make rice pudding, real rice, obviously no oats or wheats present. You're allowed to use these things on Pesach. There's no concern of rice. And he doesn't comment about kitniot. And we know that his son, the Tur, said similarly. And again, the Tur, the son of the Rosh, who had fled from Ashkenaz to Sfarad, from Ashkenaz to Spain, he writes in source 9 in his Arba Turim in the laws of Pesach, V'yesh, this is the son of the Rosh, V'yesh osrim le'achol orez v'chol minei kitniot b'tafshil. And there are those that forbid rice and any other legumes which are cooked on Pesach. So this is already important. He says that because there are wheat products which could get mixed up with them. As I mentioned, that wasn't immediately implied by this, what we saw in the Rabbeinu Peretz's synopsis of the sugya, but here is a more pragmatic concern, not that people are going to get mixed up, but actually bits of wheat could get mixed up. Nonetheless, says the Tur, the son of the Rosh, it's an excessive, superfluous stringency, and that's not the minhag. So the Tur also recognizes it. So we have here a prevalent minhag which was forming and taking place and becoming more and more universal in Ashkenaz, spreading from Tzarfat to Ashkenaz, from France to Germany, and sort of impacting the entire community of Ashkenaz. You have the Rosh who escaped Ashkenaz and also in some sense escaped the Gezerah of Kitniyot and ended up in Sfarad in Spain. And his son writes that this is a chumya yotera, it's an excessive stringency and is not a minhag. And from here on in, we essentially have a turf war of generations between Ashkenazim and Sfaradim. If you look at the Shulchan Aruch and his Bet Yosef, after citing all of the Rishonim who bring the opinion, he says in source 10, no one is concerned for these things, only the Ashkenazim. So this is what Rav Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, writes in his Bet Yosef, his commentary on the aforementioned Torah. The Bet Yosef says, we're not concerned for these things. Only the Ashkenazim are concerned, but we don't do this. And he recognizes that this was an Ashkenazi stringency, but I, Rav Yosef Karo, I'm writing the Shulchan Aruch, we're not concerned for such things. Of course, the Ramah, the ultimate authority of Ashkenaz, cannot be silent. And he has to jump in here on the turf war with his, 5 words there. And source 11, the Ramah immediately in his Darchei Moshe, his commentary on that Beit Yosef says, don't worry. V'anu b'nei ha'ashkenazim nahago lahachmir. We, the Ashkenazim, don't worry, we have the minhag to be machmir. So he sort of turns it on its head. This actually reminds me of a story I heard about Rav Ovadia Yosef Zatzal, this sort of turf war, that when Rav Ovadia Yosef became, in his early days, became the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, as he was a rabbi of various places, and at a certain point he was chief rabbi of Tel Aviv. So it used to say on all of the hechsherim, or in the instructions from the Rabbanut of Tel Aviv, that that we do not, it has the rules of what's chametz and what's not chametz, and the practices, and on the hechsherim as well, but also from the list of directions for the Rabbanut. And the letter would come out from the Rabbanut with all the Hilchot Pesach, and it would say, and we and rice and kitniyot are chametz, but Sfaradim are mekel, but Sfaradim are lenient. So when Rav Ovadia became the Rav Harashi of Tel Aviv, he switched it round. He said that Kitniyot are not chametz, Kitniyot are absolutely okay to eat, but Ashkenazim are machmir. So it's nice to know that, 500 years ago, the Bet Yosef and the Ramah, Yosef Karo and the Ramah were having this sort of halachic turf war of each one bringing, their Ga'ava Ashkenazit and Ga'ava Sfaradit, but ultimately we know that Ad Hayom Hazeh, to this very day, we have this sort of same sort of banter, as we call it in England, between different communities and the pride of Minhagei Hamakom. But it's just fascinating to see this played out here in the Bet Yosef and in the Darchei Moshe, in the Shulchan Aruch and Ramah, respectively. So really, by this point, it's become formalized as a Ashkenazic versus Faradi, or at least Adot HaMizrach versus Ashkenazi machloket about whether this very minhag was accepted or not. Having said that, the story doesn't end here, and though we will see inside various leniencies regarding Kitniyot in a moment, not everyone came quietly in Ashkenaz, even after it had been paskened. And I'd like to look here in the Market Siyah, which is written by Rav Yaakov Emden, the son of the Chacham Tzvi, who speaks about the desire of his father, the Chacham Tzvi, who tried unsuccessfully to uproot the minhag of Kitniyot, particularly because it became more and more difficult. And let's see what the Yavitz, that Rav Yaakov Emden, the son of the Chacham Tzvi, writes here about Kitniyot after the Sakim of the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah in source 12. He says as follows. So he says, I testify in the name of my late father, who is the Chacham Tzvi, as I put in parentheses. How much pain it caused him. It ached the Chacham Tzvi, this minhag of Kitniyot. Kol Chag HaMatzot haya mitzra'em v'omer. Each and every Chag HaMatzot, each and every Pesach, he would be angry and he would say, my father, the Chacham Tzvi, if I had the power, Avataline leminhag garua halaz. I would cancel this terrible custom. Clearly, he was a fan of rice. Dei chumra da'ati li dei kula. V'nafik midei churba u'michshal be'isur chametz gamur. What was his rationale? We'll see it inside now. He says it's a chumrah which leads to a kula. It's a stringency, argued the Chacham Tzvi, that leads to a leniency. Because it actually causes churba, it causes more halachic destruction and michshal, it causes more problems than it comes to solve. Why? Explains the Rabbi Yaakov Emden in the name of his father, Chacham Tzvi, third line in source 12. Since the kitniyot are not readily are no longer available. In other words, they're off the menu. Once kitniyot are no longer allowed to be eaten by Jews of Ashkenaz, we don't have the Asher Ad or the Rami Levi selection that we have today. What do they have to resort to in their little shtetl in Europe? Srichin le'efot lechem matzah harbe. As a result, what do you eat on Pesach? They're going to have to bake more and more matzahs. Now, this is not like today where you can go and just buy the box in the store. People were making their home baked matzah, and with all the chumras surrounding Pesach at the kitchen and the kashering and the minhagim and the stringencies, at the end of the day, the bottom line, the most important thing to get right is your matzah meal. That's where, unfortunately, the biggest danger, the biggest risk of chametz is that the oven wasn't cleaned properly, that the baking of matzah, and that's why most of us do not make our own matzah because it requires a very specific method, and you need matzah with a good hechsher. And he says here that as a result of you forbidding people eating kitniyot, which are technically permissible, people are going to have to resolve to baking lots and lots of matzah. And that's where all of the takalot, all the mistakes of chametz really can happen. So because of this minhag, which its relevance is questionable in terms of getting, people getting mixed up about rice versus wheat or getting the wrong type of grain, ultimately it's going to cause more issues because now every Amaretz, all the masses are all going to start baking matzahs at home, and they might not be makpid on all the halachot of leavening matzah. Al ken ani omer betach, and therefore I say for sure, says the Yavit, says Rav Yaakov Hamdin, Hamavatal minhag zeh maniat achilat kitniyot. Anyone who cancels this minhag, he adds on together with any other bad minhagim. Yi chelki imo. I mean, they made my portion be with that person. Halavai yaskimu imadi gedole hadar b'machoz halaz. This is what his father Chacham Tzvi said. If only the gedolim of Ashkenaz would agree with me. And he goes on. This is really quite poetic. He says, "Hineni liot nitpal ledvar mitzvah zo." Here I am, ready to be part of, joined with this great mitzvah to stop people accidentally baking matzahs incorrectly, which could lead to issues of chametz, and instead to allow them to eat kitniyot. B'chol yamai ha'iti omedu matzapeh matai yavo liyadi v'ashavtem dat avi mori hamanoach. If I was waiting for all the days when I had the opportunity to mefarsem, to publicize the opinion of my late father and rabbi, to uproot such a string of stringencies, that the majority of the community are unable to withstand. Despite the great poetic passion of the Yavitz in the name of his father, Chacham Tzvi, in contrast to his last words here, I would argue that Rav Hatzibor Yochalim La'amod Behen, that the minhag nonetheless endured, and despite attempts to nullify the minhag, and it's ongoing at Hayom Hazeh, the Aruch HaShulchan, which I didn't cite on the page, and many others continued to say this is minhag, and it does make sense. And even if perhaps some of the original decrees, the rationale behind the original decree that people are going to get mixed up, isn't relevant, the other rationale offered that the wheat actually can grow and get mixed up inside the grain sack in the field, that the wheat grows among the rice or whatever it might be, or among the other grains, that perhaps did remain relevant. This is the Pesach of Ashkenazim, and ultimately it was codified in the Shulchan in the Ramah, albeit not in the Shulchan Aruch, and essentially universally accepted. Having said that, there are important points here which we have to still address. One is that we recognize that there are many people, particularly if you grow up in a very Ashkenazi-centric town or community, that people really do treat kitniyot like chametz. When I was on shlichut in Melbourne, I had a woman calling me hysterically that she'd used the wrong oil, and it was kitniyot, and she's traced the kitchen. I told her, okay, firstly, we're going to take a deep breath. Definitely haven't traved to kitchen. We also, as we'll see in a moment, we paskin the kitniot is batel barov, at least after the fact. So if somebody did make a mistake, certainly nothing's treif, and even if it wasn't batel, that the kalim are fine, and it's okay. But this is important to understand that even the Ashkenazim who had adopted this opinion, we know we do not treat it like chametz gamur, and this already is in the Trumat Hadeshen here in source Rabbi Yisrael Israelin in source 14, one of the great authorities of Ashkenaz, who was asked about whether you have to sell or get rid of your kitniyot the same way you have to get rid of your chametz. He says here in source 14, She'ela, Tvu'ah shel minei kitnit, she'ena mechameshet me'aminim, shenafal aleh hamayim. So we have leavened kitniyot, or it's not really leavened because they don't leaven, but kitniyot which have come in contact with water. V'karov levadai hu shenit chamsa, there's a chance it's swelled. Sharei lahashot b'Pesach or lav. Can you own kitniyot on Pesach which have come in contact with water? Because we know that obviously you can't do that when it comes to chametz. There's a Torah prohibition of bal yira'eh bal matzeh. You cannot own or see it on Pesach. What about kitniyot which came in contact with water? Can I keep it in the house? So it says the Shrumat Hadeshin in source 14, Shuvah, the response is Yera'ed Deshari. It would seem that it's permissible. I received this same response from another rabbi as well, and he explained as follows. Right? Meanwhile, what's going on? He's living in Germany. What's going on in Paris? Rabbi Yechiel and his friends are even eating kitniyot. Inhu achali va'anan lo mashinan. They're going to eat kitniyot, and we're not even allowed to own kitniyot. Zemugzam. The words, not my words, not the Trumat Hadeshin's words. But essentially, what's he saying here? That half the Jews are eating kitniyot. We're going to say it's asher to even own it. No, this is a minhag which is taken on as maybe some sort of decree or gezerah. But nonetheless, other Jews are eating it. It cannot be that we cannot even own it, and therefore we know from there the minhag is that one can in fact own it. So one, of course, leniency of kitniyot and so chametz is ownership. But another one, as I mentioned, is that it is batel berov. The Shulchan Aruch, as we know, rules that there's no issue of kitniyot. He doesn't even discuss it because, as we saw in his Beit Yosef, the Shulchan Aruch said that's just something for the Ashkenazim. No one else holds of that. But the Ramah adds as follows in source 15. Let's see the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah continuing their turfwar now in the Shulchan Aruch, and he says, "Elu dvarim sheyotzim mehem bahem yidei chavat matzah." You can fulfill your obligation of matzah. Chitim asorim with wheat matzah, barley matzah, kusmin, spelt, shubolet, shul, oats, chiffon, and rye. Avolo ba'orez yishamanei kitniyot. You cannot have rice matzah to do your mitzvah of matzah on Seder night, or any other legumes, any other kitniyot. V'gam einam ba'im lidei chimutz. They don't leaven. Umutar lasot mehem tafshil, and therefore you can cook them and add water to them on Pesach without concern. The Ramah there, Paskining for Ashkenazic jury says in the different text there in source 15, the different font, Haggah says the Ramah, Yesh Osrim, there are those that forbid, which is the minhag of Ashkenaz. V'haminhag ba'Ashkenaz lahachmir ve'en l'shanot. The minhag in Ashkenaz is to be machmir, ve'en l'shanot, and this should not be changed. Somebody asked in the chat about coming to Israel. And does that mean we should mevatel the minhag? It's far from beyond the scope of my authority to say so. I look at the psak of the Ramah. The Ramah says that despite what the Chacham Tzvi said, and even the Yavitz and the Chacham Tzvi in the very poetic piece, passionate piece we saw earlier, wouldn't speak out against without universal consensus. And without universal consensus, the psak of the Ramah should stand for Ashkenazim. The Ramah, and we see this in many Piskei Halacha, not just in Hilchot Pesach, speaks about minhag as being mechayev. We know there's this principle minhag Yisrael Torahu, and the Ramah is very clear here that the minhag has taken hold and it shouldn't be changed. The ein l'shanot. Mihu, however, he talks about a few things where Ashkenazim can be lenient. One, of course, is owning it, as we saw, but he also says Hashut de'ein osrim b'diavad im naflu l'toch hatavshil. It's very clear that you cannot forbid it even after the fact if something fell into it. So if you're eating and your Sephardi friend dumps, I don't know what, some nice rice into your Pesach food, as long as it's not tangible, after the fact your food is still fine. And similarly, you can use kitniyot oil not in the food he's talking about, but they were talking about lighting candles. So their candles are not wax candles, but they used shmanim, they used oil. He says there's no issue to use kitniyot oil for your candles because you're not eating it. The einan osrim in naflu tachat. And if, again, not very hygienic, but think about a few hundred years ago, if you're sitting there on your table and the wax, or not the wax, but the oil, the kitniyot oil from your candle drips into your soup, you can still eat the soup. Not great in terms of hygiene, but that's what he says. In other words, we're machmir lechatchila in the first instance about kitniyot, but we don't treat it as chametz. And if it did get mixed up in your food, it doesn't usher the food, which will bring me on to another point, which in terms of what was said on the chat. I'm trying to keep track of what's going on in the chat here. Sorry, let me open the chat, see if I can see what was said here. Right, there's certainly this is constantly discussed there in terms of cancelling the minhag. For sure, when the Ramah says minhag in Ashkenaz l'hachmir ve'ein l'shanot, it was being obligating Jews in Ashkenaz. He wasn't talking about a reality when we come to Israel, and suddenly we're Baruch Hashem Kol Yisrael arevin zeh bazeh, and literally our food is ma'arevin bazeh bazeh, and that's certainly an important question. Maybe I'll touch on. I can only give my couple of cents worth. I'm not telling anyone what to do. But before we get there, I do want to discuss a couple more of the principles. So the Ramah has ruled that this is the minhag, we're machmir, but owning it is not an issue. Having it on the table is not an issue, and if it did fall in your food, is not an issue. And of course, he cites that Trumat Hadeshin that you can own it. Mushal hashot it. You don't have to sell your kitniyot, even if it's come in contact with water. Unlike another leniency among Ashkenazim is that unlike when it comes to other things, we talk about bittul b'shishim, that it's nullified in 60. When it comes to kitniyot, it's batel barov. The Mishnah Berurah that says in that Ramah here in source 16 says the Mishnah Berurah, and this is very significant. Tochatavshil umayri sheyesh al kol panim rov beheter. At the very least, it's got to be majority permissible. The imlo ken, because if that's not the case, says the Mishnah Berurah, lo mikrei taravet klal. That's not a mixture at all. Have ka'ochel tavshel b'kitniyot atzma. It's like eating kitniyot itself. What we do see from here, though, this is an important point, is that if it is a minority ingredient that fell in, then it would not usher the food. Now, this is where I think that might be, and again, I'm not telling anyone what to do here. I think that there might be more scope for Ashkenazim to be more lenient, particularly in Israel, and certainly when we go to Sfaradim. The first thing we have to recognize is that when it comes to kitniyot, it is not chametz. Secondly, it is a gezerah, which is d'Rabbanan, and it is batel barov. Generally in Ashkenazim, we do not do bittul isur lechatchila. We do not deliberately put in and say, you know what, I can cook with rice before Pesach as long as it's a minority ingredient, or I can cook with whatever minority ingredient as long as it's a minority. Having said that, if it is baked for me, then it would seem that there's no issue for an Ashkenazi to eat it, provided that it's a minority ingredient and it's not what we call be'ain. It's not tangible. If you've got a salad there and you can see the rice in it, then that would perhaps be a problem for Ashkenazim. But if it is a baked in a cake, and there's kitniyot baked in the cake, then it would seem that as long as a minority ingredient, it's okay. And therefore, while an Ashkenazi shouldn't do this lechatchila, and though for sure there is certainly those who are moving to that should be we should be mevatel, we should cancel this minhag, albeit an ancient and important one. I think those things have to happen we have to have haskama rechava, as we say. We talk all the time now in Israel about having haskama rechava. We've got to have broad consensus on issues such as this, and I'm certainly belong to that school of thought that these things need to be done on a universal level. Having said that, I think that it's important to be aware of leniencies where they exist. So if you go to a Sfaradi's house, or a Sfaradi bakes your cake, and there's minority ingredients in it which are kitniyot, then certainly no issue, in my opinion, for an Ashkenazi to eat it, as long as it's not the majority of the cake. That's certainly an important one. Similarly, you go to a Sfaradi's house, and I wouldn't eat the rice there. You can eat it. You can go to a Sfaradi's house and tell them you're Ashkenazi, but you can go to a Sfaradi's house for Pesach. So don't eat the rice, but you can eat things if it's cooked in a way that's not tangible, it's not visible. It's not discernible, but it's actually an ingredient in the food. If it's a minor ingredient and the Sephardi has not cooked it for Ashkenazim, but has in fact created it in a way that it is just they cooked for the table, they cooked for their family, and now they want to offer some to you, or you're a guest in their house, then I think that certainly would be acceptable for Ashkenazim to partake of that. This is where I think it becomes a little bit complicated. I wanted to talk about another point, which I'll get to in a moment, but I think this is where it becomes complicated as well. Is when we and there's an important factor here when we recognize we're in Israel. We one of the examples I like to give is the the Diet Coke argument. So those who drink Coke Zero or Diet Coke will notice that when you get to your kosher Pesach Coke, so the regular full, sugar, full fat Coke has usually a kosher Pesach hechsher, which includes the Rav Landau hechsher. The Diet Coke or Coke Zero will say that it's the kosher Pesach will say it's kasher and it'll be under the Rabbanut, but the Rav Landau hechsher will say it's only throughout the year, but not for Pesach. Now, why is this? Because Diet Coke or Coke Zero contains something called aspartame, which is a derivative of kitniyot. There's already a machloket among the poskim where the kitniyot shehishtanu, kitniyot which has undergone a chemical change, was originally included in the gezerah. Right? We know this in general, that anything which was not originally included in the gezerah, there's disputes about. We know there's a machloket about whether the original is exclusive, it was an exhaustive list or not. We know, for example, corn and soy are later minhagim, right? Corn only made its way from the States to Europe well after the decree, of course, from North America. And we know that similarly, soy only made its way to Europe about 300 plus years ago. Nonetheless, these things have been taken on, but we know that there are later kitniyot, and therefore, when it comes to people with celiac and the like, the first thing we're lenient with is to allow corn and to allow soy, because we know that they were not part of the original gezerah. Rav Moshe Feinstein, if we skip to source 19, says the same here regarding peanuts. Like, we'll just take a look at this, and then I'll go back to my Coke point. He says here in source 19, let's look at Rav Moshe Feinstein. I'm sorry, I'm skipping around just to go an eye on the time. He says in source 19, Hine bidvar ha-peanut, right? I don't think that needs translating. Right? When it comes to the peanut, to katavti, shaba be'makomot achlu otam bePesach. Many places would eat peanuts on Pesach. We know in Israel, there was a minhag to treat peanuts as kitniyot and peanut oil, but Rav Moshe Feinstein ruled that there's no issue because peanuts did not make it to Europe till well after any decree, and therefore they were not included in the original minhag. And he says that there are many who eat it, and the questioner, why is it that we don't include it? There's some remote place in the world where they make peanut flour. They make flour out of peanuts, and therefore you might come to get mixed up. Right? The questioner, says Rav Moshe Feinstein, knows that this is just not true. Because everything which is made with kemach was made in this. If it were true that anything which we could make into flour, we should automatically forbid, that would be a disaster. How do I know this? Says Rav Moshe Feinstein. Ultimately, what do we all resort to on Pesach? Potato flour, right? Not only here in America, Europe, even in Europe, for generations, we've been using potato flour. Baruch Hashem, there was a very quick discussion about it, but was immediately vetoed, Baruch Hashem. If everything which subsequently in later generations we could make into flour was included in the original gezerah, we couldn't make out of flour, we couldn't use on Pesach, then there'd be nothing to eat. And the same way that potato flour, which came later, was never included in the gezerah, says Rav Moshe Feinstein, stop looking for new chumras, and therefore he says if you don't have a particular minhag, then you can eat peanuts on Pesach. Wasn't included in the original decree. Why am I bringing this to Rav Moshe Feinstein? Because I think it's important for our discussion as well. I spoke about Coke, and I spoke about the aspartame in Diet Coke. So it's based on kitniyot, but it's undergone a chemical change, and as a result, it is kitniyot shishtanu. It's kitniyot undergone a mechanical change, which is already a machloket. Much like, by the way, kitniyot oil. We know that Rav Kook was matir to use sesame oil in the early 20th century. Rav Kook and his beit din permitted use of sesame oil, although sesame is treated as kitniyot. He allowed sesame oil, and there are many in Yerushalayim in the Badatz in Yerushalayim who disagreed. But again, because it's Yotzei Kitniyot, it's a derivative of Kitniyot, and that itself is a discussion. Certainly, when it comes to a minor ingredient, it's something like Diet Coke, it is a minor ingredient, and there's a machloket about it. And whilst it's true that Ashkenazim do not do bitul lechatchila, we do not cook with Kitniyot in the first instance, even if it's a minor ingredient, in order to nullify it. Who are the Coke company producing this Diet Coke for? They're producing it for all of Am Yisrael. They're not just producing it for Ashkenazim. And therefore, if there is a minor ingredient, then I think it's certainly permissible. And therefore, the Diet Coke, as long as it's got a kosher Pesach hechsher on it, even if it's not included by Rav Landau, I think even Ashkenazim can have it. Because based on what we've seen today, it's batal barov, it's already undergone a chemical change, and therefore I think there's a good reason that Ashkenazim should be able to have it. Similarly, when you go to the supermarket and you find items like sometimes you have in you have mayonnaise where maybe there's starch and uh, there's a minor ingredient, then certainly I think it would be the same. So whilst we still have a minhag, and I don't think that Ashkenazim should give it up, and that sort of question, in my opinion, requires a universal decision at a higher level and on a universal level. I think it's important for Ashkenazim to be aware that in my opinion, foods which are made for Am Yisrael as a whole, if they do have a minor ingredient of kitniyot, even if it hasn't undergone a chemical change, there's compelling reason to be makel. One of the things important to be aware of is that certainly when it comes to certain hechsherim, and certainly when you go to more Anglo-friendly stores, I feel so unfortunately they capitalize on this a little bit, that things will be listed as kitniyot which are clearly not kitniyot. When you have sort of tomatoes, a can of tomatoes, which says on it, lo'ochle kitniyot, but it's pure tomato, there's clearly no kitniyot there. There's maybe a concern that the jar, maybe the equipment had kitniyot on it, that there's certainly not a concern even for Ashkenazim. I think that in general that when it comes to someone asked about flour, so time's almost up, so I'll try and cover a couple of questions. I'm not sure I'll get through it all. When it comes to flour, so flour would be under the same gezerah. Having said that, if it is a minor ingredient, which is, as I said, made not for Ashkenazim exclusively, but for Am Yisrael, then I think arguably it's batal barov, it's already nullified, and therefore there's reason and there's grounds to Ashkenazim to eat it and to be lenient. Based on what we just saw, who was Moshe Feinstein, I think that where Ashkenazim can and should be lenient is that the Kitniyot decree has already been expanded so much, we shouldn't be looking to expand it further. So things like quinoa, there are those who didn't eat it. I grew up without eating it, but we know that quinoa didn't make its way across and was not in the original decree. I think it's certainly something which Ashkenazim should eat. Someone asked about liftit. So the Rabbanut has gone through a change in this degree and now in this regard. And now things which used to be listed as kitnit, as liftit rather, they contain basically canola oil. They used to be listed as la'ochle kitniyot, and now they say la'ochle liftit. On a lot of the elite chocolate, they will say kasher lepesach la'ochle liftit. Now, liftit, it basically means or lecithin, right? It's lecithin, which essentially it means that it contains canola oil. Now, canola oil is made from rapeseed, which is not only not edible, it's poisonous, and therefore there's much discussion about this. Rabbi Pesach Frank was lenient about rapeseed oil, about canola oil, and permitted it, whereas we know that there were others, the Avnei Nezer and others who were machmir. But again, I think that there's grounds to use it, and even one who doesn't use canola oil, I think that there's good reason to be lenient and to eat chocolate, because again, firstly it's a minor ingredient, and furthermore, when one goes to another's house and they use canola, but you have a minhag not to use canola, it's a minor ingredient in the salad or the cooking, whatever it might be, then certainly Ashkenazim can be lenient. We are out of time. I didn't get a chance to show you. But another important point was about kalim, to use your utensils. So because we don't treat kitniyot as mamash chametz, so there are those who say that you can have it on your Pesach plates, and the Kaf HaChaim writes that after 24 hours already Ashkenazim can use it on their plates, and then as long as the plate's not ben yomo, in other words, hasn't been used for hot in the last 24 hours, you're okay. And certainly Ashkenazim can do that. That's typically what we do in Israel when the eighth day Pesach, meaning Isru Chag Pesach, falls on Shabbat. So you can even with an Erev Tafshilin, you can even cook on Pesach rice for to have on Isru Chag. We don't have that this year. But certainly, Rav Ovadia also rules, Rav Ovadia Yosef in the Chavedat and elsewhere, if you go to a Sephardi's house, you can use their plates even if they're not, if they have been used for hot in the last 24 hours. So whilst you can't have the rice, you can't have your rice at the Sephardi house, you can have your cake and eat it in the sense that if the Sephardi, even if they've used hot food on their plates, you don't have to ask questions. And as long as you don't use be'ain, you don't use tangible, open, like that. You can't take yourself a spoonful of rice. But if they've cooked with kitniyot, minor ingredients, that would be acceptable, I think, for Ashkenazim. If they're serving it to you, if they've made it for the whole family. And then I said, I think that when it comes to minor ingredients in the foods, that um, there would be room to be makel as well. As for the comment, it takes broad shoulders time to end the minhag. Certainly, it will require broad shoulders. I think you need shoulders a little bit broader than mine. But certainly, I think where there's room to be makel already within the minhag, I think it's important that we're aware of those leniencies, which are legitimate. And uh, and as I said, Baruch Hashem, Kol Yisrael Arevin Zeh Bazeh, that we don't have to ostracize our Sephardi friends and brothers and sisters, but we can certainly eat there within the appropriate constraints. Bezrat Hashem, you should go from strength to strength. We should have a bit more awareness about Kitniyot, and it should make our shopping in the supermarket a little bit easier as well. That we don't have to always go to the expensive American shops to get everything. That no, even things which are listed as a Kitniyot might not be Kitniyot, and if there's a questionable ingredient and it's minor, there's grounds for Ashkenazim as well. And Bezrat Hashem, we should be better prepared for Pesach and Yitzhak. Wishing you all a good rest of day and hopefully a quieter day than this morning was as well.